4 p.m., the telegraph operator at Fort Laramie received alarming news. He immediately sent the telegraph to Colonel William Collins, commander at Fort Laramie and colonel of the 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry. Telegraph station at Mud Springs in western Nebraska, about 100 miles east of Fort Laramie, was being attacked by a war party of several hundred Cheyenne and Lakota warriors. The station at Mud Springs housed 14 men, a telegraph operator, 4 civilian employees of a stock company, and 9 soldiers. Hi, I am the Wyoming Traveler, and in this video I am going to tell the story of 2 Indian battles, the Battle of Mud Springs and the associated Battle of Rush Creek. As with all Indian sites, there is not much today that indicates that a battle was taking place there. In fact, at this particular site, it's extremely difficult to find. I got lost while looking for it, and the state historical marker is not at the site or even near the site, nor does it even tell you where the battle took place. Just a sign there that talks about the battle itself. While doing my research on the battle, I discovered an archaeological report that was done at the sites back in 2009. Therefore, I am going to use not only the historical research about the battle, but the archaeological report, some first-hand accounts, and Colonel Collins' official report to the War Department. Colonel Collins reacted quickly, and in his report writes,
I ordered Lieutenant Ellsworth, commanding Company H, 11th OVC at Camp Mitchell, with all men he could spare to the relief of Mud Springs Station, to travel all night and if possible reach there by morning. He arrived at Mud Springs by daylight of the 5th with 36 men.
Camp Mitchell is 55 miles from Mud Springs, and it took the troopers 12 hours to reach the station. Private David Peck, Company H, 11th OVC, from Fort Mitchell, wrote of their arrival at Mud Springs.
The company halted, and the bugler was ordered to sound the bugle so that the besieged would know that help was at hand. When we got to the boys, the doors were thrown open, and an old soldier named Idlet cried out for joy.
The warriors were surprised at the increase of men at the station and broke off the attack, but remained in the sight of the station all day. Colonel Collins continued in his report.
In the meantime, I left Fort Laramie with about 120 men, consisting of various companies of the 11th OVC and part of Company D of the 7th Iowa Volunteer Cavalry. My command traveled all night and reached Camp Mitchell during the afternoon of the 5th. The night was severely cold, and several men were so frozen as to be unable to proceed further.
Private George Nelson, Company I, 11th OVC, described the march.
Having marched for 2 nights and a day in terribly cold weather, with no sleep and but little rest, we are in rather a sorry plight, many of the men having their hands and feet badly frozen.
This is Mud Springs today. The monument does not commemorate the battle, but rather the site of a Pony Express station. A drawing of the station in 1865, probably by Lieutenant Casper Collins. Mud Springs today and the approximate location of the station and the corrals. By the time Lieutenant Ellsworth arrived at the station, there were some 1,000 warriors in the hills. Ellsworth sent 16 men to occupy a bluff and prevent the Indians from getting too close to the buildings. These troopers were, however, attacked by about 500 warriors and forced to retreat back to the station. The colored dots indicate where shell casings or bullets were found. The colors indicate if findings were from Indians or troopers. The soldiers then released the horses from the corrals. This had the effect of dispersing most of the Indians as they attempted to capture the horses. Collins rested briefly at Fort Mitchell and then proceeded with 25 men to Mud Springs. They reached the station at 2 a.m. in the morning of the 6th. The remainder of the command arrived around 8 o'clock. All were exhausted and many frostbitten. Some hours later, between 500 and 1,000 warriors arrived to resume their attack. Collins describes the situation upon his arrival.
The station is also utterly indefensible, being surrounded by hills and knolls full of gullies, enabling the Indians to ambush by creeping upon us at points where they could not be reached by a cavalry charge. Shortly after our main body got in, they attacked us in force and with great boldness. We found it necessary to imitate the Indians, get under the banks and creep up to favorable positions, watch for an Indian's head, shoot the moment it was shown, and pop down at the flash of this gun. The men got quite handy at this game and soon made any ground occupied by the Indians too hot for them.
Soon, 200 Indians worked their way into a ravine and began to shower arrows into the men and horses. Collins wrote,
"At one time there were some 200 Indians behind a hill and in its ravines, where they could come within 75 yards of the buildings at the station. From this point arrows came in showers, the Indians shooting them keeping entirely out of sight. The arrows were discharged at an angle of about 45 degrees, making a curve and descending upon us at about the same angle. Many horses and mules and some men were wounded in this manner."
The archaeology photo shows placement of Indian positions during the battle.
It became evident that this point must be cleared, and arrangements were made for two parties to charge, one on foot to drive them out, the other on horseback to head them off, when the Indians, finding a half-dozen rifles leveled at each head that was shown, abandoned this position. We immediately took possession of it, dug a rifle pit on the highest point, and had no more trouble from that quarter. After 4 hours of fighting, we began to press them back in all directions and soon drove them off.
Shortly after his arrival at Mud Springs, Colonel Collins telegraphed Fort Laramie for a field piece. After the line was cut, repairs, and cut again, the Indians had learned to not only cut the telegraph wire, but to remove it as well, and cut down the poles and remove them also. The soldiers were, however, able to keep the line to Fort Laramie open using wire east of the station. That evening, the station was fortified. On the 7th, the Indians were gone. The soldiers reconnoitered the area and determined the warriors had moved towards Rush Creek, some 10 miles east of Mud Springs. The howitzer and its escort had arrived at daylight on the 8th, and Collins organized a pursuit, ending the Battle of Mud Springs and opening the Battle of Rush Creek. That morning, February 8th, Colonel Collins organized a pursuit of the warriors. Colonel Collins stated,
"The Indians seemed to concentrate generally toward the springs on Rush Creek, about 10 miles distant.
The pursuit party found the Indian camp. It was, however, deserted. As many as 5,000 Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Lakota had camped along Rush Creek and the North Platte River. The soldiers found the remains of over 100 slaughtered cattle, as well as empty cans of meat, fruit, and flour sacks, all from their raids along the South Platte and North Platte rivers. The Indians had planned to remain in the area for several days to rest their horses before heading north. not anticipating the soldiers would follow them. Upon seeing the soldiers, the Indians quickly broke camp and moved into the hills north of the river. A force of between 1,000 to 2,000 warriors prepared to attack the soldiers. Colonel Collins continued in his report.
It was now clear we had underestimated the number against us. With field glass, they could be distinctly seen and examined. There were at least 2,000 warriors in sight. It was evident that all the hostile Indians that had been committing depredations and holding the country along the South Platte were concentrated here.
Private Nelson gave his account.
We had about 180 to 190 men.
Historians give the account between 140 to 185 men. Nelson goes on.
When we arrived at the Platte, we could see Indians in great number on the opposite side of the river, which was frozen over solid, so that we could have crossed easily. This Collins wanted to do, and attack they in the hills. Had this been attempted, the result would have been disastrous.
Colonel Collins confirmed this view. He stated,
The river was about a half a mile wide and frozen over. While we were looking for a crossing, they saved us the trouble by commencing to swarm down to the riverbank and come over the ice, 1 or 2 miles above and below us. We had barely time to corral our train before they were upon us on every side.
Colonel Collins formed a defensive perimeter with the wagons and rifle pits. Sharpshooters were placed on the hills commanding the wagon perimeter. After the initial charge, the sharpshooters and a barrage from the howitzer kept the Indians at a distance, and the fighting developed into a long-distance shooting match. Colonel Collins describes the battle as follows.
At one point, we were greatly annoyed by a party of 10 to 15 behind a little knoll about 400 yards distance, and it became evident that they must be dislodged. A detail of 16 mounted men was ordered to charge at full speed, revolvers in hand, to clear out the Indians behind the hillock and return immediately. It was admirably done.
While the charge was successful, it was not accomplished without hazard. A group of 150 to 200 warriors rode down to save their comrades. A short hand-to-hand fight ensued, in which 2 troopers were killed. Private Nelson describes the engagement.
The Indians now rose up from all sides and in the middle to try and cut off the gallant lieutenant and his little band. This, however, we had expected, and from our breastwork we fired into them a murderous volley that made them recoil and gave the charging squad a chance to get back.
At sunrise of the 9th, around 400 warriors came across the river, both above and below the fortified soldiers. The 2 forces skirmished at long range. Then the Indians recrossed the river and moved into the hills, burning the grass behind them as they moved north. Collins considered pursuit to be injudicious and useless. That afternoon, he marched his command 15 miles up the Platte. There he divided the command, sending part of the force back to Fort Mitchell and Fort Laramie. Collins, with the other half of the detachment, returned to Mud Springs. On the 10th, he marched south to reopen communications with garrisons and settlements on the South Platte River, and the following day began the return to Fort Laramie, which he arrived at on the 14th. The Army lost 2 men killed, 17 wounded, and 10 frostbitten. The Indian casualties are harder to determine. Collins reported 100 to 150 Indian casualties. George Bent, a Cheyenne warrior, in an interview years later, says only 2 Indians were wounded in the fighting. Colonel Collins summarizes the battle as follows.
In extreme cold weather, in the dead of winter, the main body marched nearly 400 miles in 10 days much of the time at night, without tents or shelter, camped on the ground, often without fire, on short rations and forage, and met and repulsed in every engagement a brave and cunning foe, numbering at least 10, probably 15 to 1.
I appreciate you watching the video and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. If you like this video, please give a comment, like, and if you have not, subscribe to the channel.